Chapter 17. Hatchet. He turned back to his campsite and looked at the wreckage. He had to do it. Rebuild his shelter, get a new fire going, and find some food, or get ready to find some food. Make weapons. He had to work slowly because his ribs hurt. First things first, he had to try to find some dry grass and twigs, then peeled bark from a nearby birch and shred into a fire nest. He worked slowly, but even so, with his new skill, he had a fire going in less than an hour. The flames cut the cool, damp morning, crackled, and did much to bring up his spirits, not to mention chasing away the incessant mosquitoes. With the fire going, he searched for very dry wood. The rain had driven water into virtually all the wood he could find, and at last he located some in a thick evergreen where the top branches had covered the lower dead ones, keeping them dry. He had great difficulty breaking them, not being able to pull much with his arms or chest muscles, but finally got enough to keep the fire going all day and into night. With that, he rested a bit, eased his chest, and then set about getting a shelter squared away. Much of the wood from his original wall and still nearby and up and back of the ridge. He actually found a major section of the weave still intact. The wind had torn it out, lifted it, and thrown it to the top of the ridge, and Brian felt lucky once more that he had not been killed or more seriously injured, which would have been the same, he thought. If he couldn't hunt, then he would die, and if he were injured badly, he would not be able to hunt. He jerked and dragged the wood around until the wall was once more in place. Crudely, but he could improve it later. He had no trouble finding enough pine boughs to make a new bed. The storm had torn the forest into pieces. Up and back of the ridge, it looked like a giant had become very angry and used some kind of massive meat grinder on the trees. Huge pines were twisted and snapped off, blown sideways. The ground was so littered with limbs and treetops sticking every which way that it was hard to get through. He pulled enough thick limbs for a bed, green and spicy, with new broken sap smell. And by evening, he was exhausted, hungry, and hurting. But he had something close to a place to live again, a place to be. Tomorrow, he thought, as he lay back in the darkness, tomorrow maybe the fish would be back and he would make a spear and a new bow and get some food. Tomorrow he would find food and refine the camp and bring things back to sanity from one completely insane day. He faced the fire. Curving his body, he rested his head on his arm and began to sleep when a picture came into his head. The tail of the plane sticking out of the water. There it was, the tail sticking up. And inside the plane, near the tail, somewhere, was the survival pack. It must have survived the crash because the plane's main body was still intact. That was the picture, the tail sticking up and the survival pack inside. Right there in his mind as he dozed, his eyes snapped open. If I could get that pack, he thought. Oh, if I could get that pack. It probably had food and knives and matches. It might have a sleeping bag. It might have fishing gear. Oh, it must have so many wonderful things. If I could get the pack and just get some of those things, I would be rich. So rich if I could get the pack. Tomorrow. He watched the flames and smiled. Tomorrow I'll see. All things come tomorrow. He slept deep and down with only the picture of the plane's tail sticking up in his mind. A healing sleep. In the morning, he rolled out before the true light. In the gray dawn, he built up the fire and found more wood for the day, feeling almost chipper because his ribs were much better now. With the camp ready for the day, he looked to the lake. Part of him had half expected the plane tail to be gone, sunk back into the depths, but he saw it was still there. Didn't seem to have moved at all. He looked down at his feet and saw that there were some fish in his fish pen looking for tiny bits of bait still left from before the wind came. He found impatience to get on the plane project and remembered what he had learned. Food first, because food made strength. First food, then action. There were fish at hand here, and he might not be able to get anything from the plane. That was all a dream. The fish were real, and his stomach, even his newly shrunken stomach, was sending signals that it was savagely empty. He made a spearfish with 2 points, not peeling the bark all the way back, but just working on the pointed end. It took him an hour or so, and all the time he worked, he sat looking at the tail of the plane sticking up in the air, his hands working on the spear, his mind working on the problem of the plane. When the spear was done, although still crude, he jammed a wedge between the points to spread them apart and went to the fish pond. There were not clouds of fish, but at least 10, and he picked one of the larger ones, a round fish almost 6 inches long, and put the spear point into the water, held it, and then thrust it with a flicking motion of his wrist when the fish was just above the point. When the fish was pinned neatly, he took two more with the same ease and then carried all three fish back up to the fire. He had a fish board now, a piece of wood that he had flattened with the hatchet, that leaned up by the fire for cooking fish, so he didn't have to hold a stick all the time. He put the three fish on the board, pushed the sharpened pegs through their tails into the cracks on the cooking board, and propped it next to the reddest part of the coals. In moments, the fish were hissing and cooking with the heat, and as soon as they were done, or when he could stand the smell no longer, he picked the steaming meat from under the loosened skin and ate it. The fish did not fill him, did not even come close. Fish meat was too light for that. But they gave him strength, and he could feel it moving into his arms and legs, and he began to work on the plane project. While making the spear, he had decided that what he would have to do is make a raft and push paddle the raft to the plane and tie it there for a working base. Somehow he'd have to get into the tail inside the plane, rip or cut his way in, and however he did it, he would need an operating base of some kind. A raft, which he found ruefully was much easier said than done. There was plenty of logs around. The shore was littered with driftwood, new and old, tossed up and scattered by the tornado. And it was a simple matter of finding four of them about the same length and pull them together. Keeping them together was part of the problem. Without rope or cross pieces, the logs just rolled and separated. He tried wedging them together, crossing them over each other. Nothing seemed to work. And he needed a stable platform to get the job done. It was becoming frustrating, and he had a momentary loss of temper, as he would have done in the past, when he was the other person. At that point, he sat back on the beach, studied the problem again. Sense. He had to use his sense. That's all it took to solve problems, just sense. It came then. The logs he had selected were smooth and round and had no limbs, but what he needed were logs with limbs sticking out so he could cross the limbs of one log over the other and weave them together, as he had done with his first wall, the shelf cover, and the fish gate. He scanned the area above the beach and found four dry tree tops that had been broken off by the storm. These had limbs, and he dragged them down to his work area at the water's edge and fitted them together. It took most of the day. The limbs were cluttered and stuck any which way, and he would have to cut one to make another fit. Then he would cut another one from another log to come back to the first one, and then still another from the third log would have to be pulled in. But at last, in the late afternoon, he was done, and the raft, which he called Brush Pile, one for its looks, hung together even as it pulled into the water off the beach. It floated well. If low in the water, as in the excitement, he started for the plane. He could not stand it, but he would have to swim alongside it. He was out to about chest depth when he realized he had no way to keep the raft at the plane. He needed some way to tie it in place so he could work from it. For a moment he was stymied. He had no rope, only the bowstring and the other cut shoestring in his tennis shoe, which were now looking close to dead, his shoes showing at the tops. Then he remembered his windbreaker, and he found the tattered part he used for an arrow pouch. He tore it into narrow strips and tied them together to make a rope, or a tie-down, about 4 feet long. It wasn't strong. He couldn't use it to pull a Tarzan swing from a tree, but it should hold a raft to the plane. Once more he slid the raft off the beach and into the water until he was chest deep. He left his tennis shoes in the shelter when he felt the sand turn to mud between his toes as he kicked the bottom and began to swim. Pushing the raft, he figured, was about like trying to push an aircraft carrier. All the branches that stuck down into the water were dragged and pulled. The logs themselves fought away any forward motion, and he hadn't gone 20 feet when he realized that it was going to be much harder than he thought to get the raft to the plane. It barely moved, and if he kept going this way, he would just about reach the plane at dark. He decided to turn back again and spend the night and start early in the morning, and he pulled the raft once more onto the sand and wide scraped it dry with his hand. Patience. He was better now, but impatience still grounded him. So he sat at the edge of the fish pond with the new spear, took 3 more fish, cooked them up, and ate them, which helped pass the time until dark. He also dragged in more wood, endless wood, and then relaxed and watched the sunset over the trees in the back of the ridge. West, he thought. I'm watching the sunset in the west. And the north was that way where his father was, and that way was east, and that way was south, and somewhere to the south and east his mother would be. The news would be on the television. He could visualize more easily his mother doing things than his father, because he'd never been to where his father lived now. He knew everything about how his mother lived. She would have had the small television on the kitchen counter on and be watching the news and talking about how awful it was in South Africa, or how cute the baby in the commercial looked, talking and making sounds, cooking sounds. He jerked his mind back to the lake. There was a great beauty here, almost unbelievable beauty. The sun exploded the sky, just blew it up with the setting color, and that color came down into the water of the lake, and it lit the trees. Amazing beauty, and he wished he could share it with somebody and say, "Look there, over there, and see that?" But even alone, it was beautiful, and he fed the fire to cut the night chill. There it is again, he thought, that late summer chill to the air, the smell of fall. He went to sleep thinking a kind of reverse question. He did not know if he would ever get out of this, could not see how it might be, but if he did somehow get home and go back to the living the way he had lived, would it be just the opposite? Would he be sitting watching television and suddenly think about the sunset back at the ridge and wonder how the color of the lake looked? Sleep. In the morning, the chill was more pronounced, and he could see wisps of vapor from his breath. He threw wood on the fire and blew it until it flamed, and then banked the flames to last and went down to the lake. Perhaps because the air was so cool, the water felt warm as he waded in. He made sure the hatchet was still at his belt and the raft still held together, and then he set out, pushing the raft and kicking and swimming towards the tail of the plane. As before, it was very hard going. Once an eddy of a breeze came up against him, and he seemed to be standing still, and by the time he was close enough to the tail to see the rivets in the aluminum, he had pushed and kicked for over 2 hours and was nearly exhausted and wished he had taken some time to get a fish or two and have breakfast. He also was as wrinkled as a prune and ready for a break. The tail looked much larger when he got to it, with the major part of the vertical stabilizer showing and perhaps half of the elevators. Only a short piece of the top of the fuselage, the plane's body towards the tail, was out of the water, just a curve of aluminum. At first, he could see no place to tie up the raft, but he pulled himself along the elevators to the end, and there he found a gap that went in up by the hinges where he could feed his rope through. With the raft secured, he climbed on top of it and lay on his back for 15 minutes, resting, letting the sun warm him. The job, he thought, looked impossible. To have any chance of success, he would have to be strong when he started. Somehow he had to get inside the plane. All openings, even the small rear cargo hatch, were underwater, so he couldn't get them without diving and coming up inside the plane, where he would be trapped. He shuddered and thought, and then remembered what was in the front of that plane. Down at the bottom of the plane, still strapped in the seat, the body of the pilot, sitting there in the water. Brian could see him, the big man with his hair waving in the current, his eyes open. Stop, he thought, stop now. Stop thinking that. He was nearly at the point of swimming back to shore and forgetting the whole thing. But the image of the survival pack kept him. If he could just get out of the plane, and if he could just get into it and pull something out, a candy bar, even that, a candy bar, would it be worth it? But how to get inside the plane? He rolled off the raft, pulled himself around the plane, no openings. 3 times he put his face in the water and opened his eyes and looked down. The water was murky, but he could see perhaps 6 feet, and there was no obvious way to get into the plane. He was blocked.